In the year 2000, two companies merged in a deal valued at $350 billion. It was the largest merger in American corporate history. Within 2 years, it had destroyed an estimated $200 billion in shareholder value. No merger before or since has lost money faster. Nobody was fired for approving it. Almost everybody got paid. That is where we begin. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand what AOL actually was in 1999. America Online was, by nearly every metric, the internet for most Americans. At its peak, AOL had over 26 million subscribers paying monthly fees for dial-up access and a walled garden experience that felt, to millions of people, like the entire World Wide Web. The company was printing money. AOL stock had risen roughly 900% across the 1990s. Its market capitalization had ballooned to around $163 billion by late 1999. For context, that was larger than Disney, larger than Ford, and nearly as large as General Motors. AOL CEO, Steve Case, understood something that almost no one else in the room was willing to say out loud. AOL stock was overvalued. The dot-com bubble was inflating every tech company's valuation to absurd multiples. Case knew the music would stop. The only question was whether AOL would be holding a chair when it did. His answer was elegant in a cold-blooded sort of way. Use the inflated stock as currency. Buy something real before the bubble popped. Buy something with physical assets, established brands, and actual cash flows. Buy something the market couldn't vaporize overnight. Time Warner was, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful media company on Earth. HBO, CNN, Warner Bros. Time Magazine, Sports Illustrated, Warner Music Group. It controlled content across film, television, print, and music. Its revenues in 1999 were approximately $27 billion. These were real dollars attached to real things. Time Warner's CEO, Gerald Levin, had his own problem. He was desperately afraid of being left behind. The internet was reshaping everything, and Time Warner, for all its content, had no credible digital strategy. AOL, with its 26 million subscribers, looked like a distribution pipeline that could carry Time Warner's content directly into American homes. Levin wanted in, and so two very different anxieties found each other in a conference room. Steve Case needed to trade inflated paper for real assets. Gerald Levin needed a digital future he didn't know how to build. On January 10, 2000, they announced the deal. AOL would acquire Time Warner in an all-stock transaction. AOL shareholders would own 55% of the combined company. Time Warner shareholders would own 45%. The financial press called it visionary. Analysts called it transformative. The board of Time Warner approved it unanimously. Of course they did. The strategic logic on paper was not entirely delusional. The theory was synergy. AOL's subscriber base and digital reach combined with Time Warner's premium content would create an unstoppable media and internet juggernaut. AOL would deliver Time Warner content. Time Warner would legitimize AOL. Together, they would own the future. There were several things this theory required to be true. AOL's subscriber growth had to continue. Broadband internet, which bypassed AOL's dial-up service entirely, had to remain slow to adopt. The two corporate cultures, which were about as compatible as vinegar and oil, had to somehow integrate, and the stock market had to stay irrational long enough for the deal to close. None of those things happened. The deal officially closed in January 2001. By that point, the Nasdaq had already fallen roughly 50% from its March 2000 peak. AOL's stock, the currency the entire deal was priced in, had collapsed. Time Warner shareholders had effectively agreed to be acquired by a company that was worth half what it claimed to be when they signed the papers. Inside the merged company, the culture clash was immediate and vicious. Time Warner's old media executives viewed AOL's people as overpaid hustlers running a CD mailing operation. AOL's executives viewed Time Warner as a bureaucratic dinosaur that didn't understand the internet. Both assessments contained enough truth to be useless as a management philosophy. The advertising revenue that AOL had promised to deliver to Time Warner failed to materialize. AOL's ad sales had been built on the dot-com boom, and the dot-com boom was over. Internal investigations would later reveal that AOL had reportedly engaged in questionable accounting practices to inflate its advertising revenue figures in the months before the merger closed. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched an investigation. AOL Time Warner eventually paid $510 million to settle charges related to its accounting. Broadband adoption, meanwhile, accelerated faster than almost anyone had predicted. By 2002, millions of American households were switching from dial-up to high-speed cable and DSL connections. Those connections did not require AOL. AOL's subscriber base, the entire premise of the company's value, began to erode. The 26 million subscribers would eventually dwindle to under 10 million by the end of the decade. In April 2002, AOL Time Warner announced what remains one of the largest single-year losses in American corporate history, a net loss of $98.7 billion for the fiscal year 2001. The majority of that figure came from goodwill write-downs, accounting's polite way of saying that what they paid for was not worth what they paid. The $350 billion deal was being repriced by reality, and reality was not being generous. Gerald Levin resigned in May 2002. Steve Case stepped down as chairman in January 2003. Ted Turner, Time Warner's largest individual shareholder, lost an estimated $8 billion on the deal personally. He later called it the worst deal of the century. He was not being hyperbolic. In 2009, Time Warner spun off AOL as an independent company. The combined entity that had been worth $350 billion at announcement was, by that point, valued at a fraction of what either company had been worth separately. AOL was spun off with a market cap of roughly $3.4 billion. Time Warner itself was eventually acquired by AT&T in 2018 for $85 billion, a real number, but a shadow of what was lost. AOL was later sold to Verizon in 2015 for $4.4 billion, then sold again, along with Yahoo, to a private equity firm in 2021 for $5 billion. A company that had once been worth $163 billion, sold for $5 billion, bundled with another failed internet giant, as a package deal. The market has a long memory and no sentimentality. Here is the lesson, and it is not subtle. When a company uses overvalued stock to acquire real assets, it is not creating value. It is transferring the risk of its own overvaluation onto the seller. The seller, in this case, agreed to be paid in a currency that was already depreciating. That is not a merger. That is an elaborate transfer of losses. The deeper lesson is about the danger of strategic panic. Gerald Levin did not need AOL. Time Warner had HBO, Warner Bros., and CNN. What he needed was patience and a competent digital strategy. Instead, he signed a deal in 72 hours of negotiation that he admitted, years later, he had not fully thought through. Urgency is the enemy of due diligence, and executives who are afraid of being left behind have a remarkable talent for making sure they are. If you want to understand how Comcast built the empire that Time Warner tried and failed to become, that story is next. Subscribe for more hidden empires.